Hi, Rosemary. Welcome.
Hi, Phoebe. How are you?
Hello. I'm well, thank you. Are you calling from Australia?
I am, yes.
Oh,
from
amazing.
the Sydney Policy Lab.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, it's really good that you guys can join us this time.
Yeah, really happy to.
Hey, Alice.
How's it going? Oh,
I think now we can, I couldn't hear you before, but I can hear you now. So hi.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've just realized,
Hi.
annoyingly, I've activated waiting room for this Zoom call. So I'm gonna have to like click everyone out. It's very annoying. I'm gonna see if
We'll
I
get admitted.
change that. Let's have a look. Hi, Tony.
Hello.
Hi, David.
Hey.
Morning.
Good
David,
evening.
you're calling from New Zealand, right?
Melbourne.
Melbourne, okay.
So yeah. Yep.
Fantastic. Hi, Amy.
Hello. How's everyone doing?
Doing all right. I'm experimenting with something called Zoom polls. So I don't know if you can see. Oh no, I haven't launched it. Okay, so I'm gonna give this a go. You should see a poll. Can you let me know if you can't see it?
Yeah, you can
Paul,
see it.
right up there.
Sorry.
I can see it.
Okay, so it's treat it with a bit of a pinch of salt. Just giving this tool a go, but it's a way of expressing how are you feeling, where are you calling from, and what are you working in, what sector are you working in, so we can kind of map that.
Hey, Thomas.
Hey, Thomas. Cool. We'll just wait until 5 past until getting started. Hi, Alina.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going good. I was really enjoyed. We were on a webinar together this morning, and Alina read an incredible poem. It was a really good way to start the day. So thank you.
What was the poem?
It's a poem that I wrote after reading Johan Rockström's book, Big World, Small Planet. It's called Big World, Small Planet, the remix. Yeah, it's on YouTube if you wanna look that up.
Yeah, we'll look it up.
I mean, Alina, if you felt like reading it, we could always think about doing that at the end, but totally up to you. No pressure at all.
Let's see how I'm feeling at like 10:30 because it's pretty late here.
Sounds good. Hi, Bronwyn.
Hi. Sorry, just like transitioning rooms. And I've just lost your visuals, but I'm Bronwyn.
Good to meet you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for. Actually, I just read something Alina wrote about the 6 narratives this afternoon, and then I was thinking, I recognize that name. There you are.
Nice. Yeah, so we've got this call as a morning call to allow for Australian and New Zealand based folks to be able to join us. So we'll do this, we'll try and keep this cycling between afternoon and morning as our group grows in numbers of people from different parts of the world.
That's fantastic.
Cool. Well, I'm actually just going to kick us off with a check-in in breakout rooms, and that will allow for the last people who are kind of trickling in. I've managed to activate the kind of waiting room function, which is quite annoying. It means I have to like keep clicking everyone in, but learning how to use Zoom in weird and wonderful ways all the time. And you should see a poll that you can have a look at, where you can express how are you feeling, where are you calling from, and what sort of area do you work in, so that we can start to visualize that a little bit. Looks like most of us are from UK, Europe, and Australia, and one from New Zealand, Nina. And it's actually quite a equal spread between all of the different professions. So we've got people in strategic communications, 56% of people in narratives, a third in storytelling, none in journalism, a third in think tanks, and a quarter in policy making, and a fifth of people in culture. Cool. So as you do that poll, I'm going to split us into breakout rooms with a really simple check-in. There's not like a deep check-in question this time, just a chance to kind of land, arrive. Maybe you can use the prompts from the poll as your starting points, and then we'll come back together and actually get into the stuff around metaphors and images that you have been invited to. So this should put people into groups of 2 to 3. So in a second, you'll see an invitation to go out into a breakout room. And in 6 minutes, I'll call you guys back. So just 2 minutes each. See you soon.
Phoebe.
Hey, couldn't see you. You're very, very blurry Ronin shape. Like an abstract, like a kind of abstract painting, like squiggles. It's quite nice. How are you?
Weird. Yeah, I'm doing hard to say really. I really like your shirt. I think that's a really cool shirt that you got on.
Thank you. It's a fave.
Do you want me to join this breakout room, or could I possibly stay and finish my breakfast?
Yeah, you can just reject your breakout. I was just I saw you come in and I was like, oh yeah, this group has only 2 people, but we can just leave them to it. What are you having for your brekkie?
Oh, dude, it's so good. I'm having leftovers from last night, which includes like broccoli, asparagus, lamb with turmeric, and then there's like nuts in there. Put egg in there this morning. Some like coconut cheese. It's really very yummy.
Yum. Coconut cheese. Coconut cheese with lamb. Like a kind of veggie, like vegan meat.
Yeah. Vegan meets carnivore.
Vegan meat. Nice.
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I have this quite necessary morning practice of like breath work and running and meditation that I usually get done by 10, including a shower and breakfast, but it eluded me today.
That's all right.
But I'm here.
Yeah, good. I'm waking up like at 6 at the moment. Just I think also with the light, like I have really light curtains, so I just by the time I get to 10, luckily I've had like 3 hours, like 4 hours where it's just me doing my thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good, isn't it?
So good.
Early morning for the way to go.
Definitely. It's like protected time. Yeah. I'm in quite.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I took basically 2 days avoiding doing anything productive or like work related, just to be with what's happening in my family and my grandmother passing. Yeah, I mean, it also felt like a lot of my being was actually not physically here. Like I felt really kind of present in, different realms, as some might say.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's just the sense of like accompanying someone you love in their transition to leaving this world. And you could get really esoteric about it, but you could also just be like, it's me making sense of that transition. Yeah, so it's been really deep. And
were you guys close?
Yeah, we were really close. But she's also been getting old for a while, and she had Alzheimer's for the last like 5 years of her life. So yeah, it wasn't a sudden thing. Yeah, but then I'm like arriving like this morning. I'm just like, okay, I can focus again. But I'm kind of like, oh, this call. Just just returning to like physical realm of stuff. Yeah.
Kind of physical realm. We're still in the online space.
Yeah, and it's still like pretty abstract. Yeah. But yeah.
Are you still with your family in Chiswick?
Yeah. So lucky. Feeling so lucky for that.
Have you got plans for after the lockdown?
I do not. Well, actually, that's a lie. Yes, I do. Tony, who you'll see on this call, and I are part of a group who is plotting to go to, Jess, to the chateau. So we've got like a group of like 20 of us who are waiting to be able to travel across and basically live in that castle for like a month or two and see what happens.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, wait, I do have plans. They just don't feel very real.
Is there any space for me, or is it all booked up?
I can inquire. It's Jess's thing with Primavera, who's another friend. But I haven't even thought to ask about people we can invite. I was just thinking, yes. And then probably once we're there, we can.
And is it what, just like, are they social change types or what?
I literally I've known that that's kind of the plan Tony and I were thinking of doing, but I didn't realize that there were going to be like, there's a little group, but I don't know anything about the other people apart from that they're probably like embassy network people.
Yeah.
But I've got to call everyone back from the breakouts, but we will finally have we should have a catch up now that I'm kind of out of this last like 5
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really free this week, so we can have it this week or whatever it suits.
Perfect. Me too.
Great. Give me 2 seconds.
All right. Hmm.
I accidentally left early.
That's all right.
I went to close the little window. I was like, get out of my way, window. I came back
Got back in.
with conversation. So sorry, Ella and Dora.
Did you at least get a little bit of check-in moment? Good. I'm excited for this call. I looked at the calendar invite and it said there's an hour and a half, and I was like, wow. didn't expect us to have so long together, but I think that's really good because it's quite a deep topic. Looks like everyone is back. Cool. And it also looks like 94% of people have apparently filled out the poll questions. So thank you. I really need to hold back my my tech geekery with Zoom, because at this rate I will just try all of the features all the time. So most of you were on our first call 2 weeks ago, but we do have, could you just give us a wave if you haven't been on one of these SG3 calls? Ella, I like how you gave a wave anyway, just yes, wave. Okay, so we've got about half of people were here before and half were not, and that's partly because also we've got people from Melbourne and Wellington joining us today, which is great. If you can mute when not talking, that's helpful. So just a tiny bit of context to open this call. This is a group that is part of a bigger group that's been meeting in response to COVID-19, specifically around this topic of strategic narratives and strategic communications, and thinking about the different responses and sense making and kind of work and collaboration that can happen in response to the pandemic. Given that we're all stuck at home as well, there's so much of this pandemic that's playing out in the non-physical realm in terms of how we're telling stories and who gets to tell those stories and what is the narrative. So that's partly why I think a lot of people have talked about how narratives are just being talked about all the time, and I don't think that's by accident. And so this convening is being done by Alice, who's on this call. If you want to give a little hello, and also Thomas Coombs, who joined in a couple of weeks ago. So hi, Thomas. And this specific smaller group I'm really excited about, because I think it's all really exciting. We've got other groups that are focusing on which narratives kind of need to be amplified at this time, and kind of technically how do we do that, and what kind of messaging can we create to support people who are telling stories about the virus or the pandemic and the response. But this group, in this group, the focus is really around these deeper narratives, and how do we kind of do the sense making and the interrogation of what are the stories and the metaphors and the narratives that could be used at this time, or need to be used at this time, to get us from what's happening to a place that could be better for all of humankind. And there's a big question too about who gets to do that, and who is able to even take part on a call like this, and how do we actually not just focus on what are the narratives and the metaphors, but also who gets to tell that narrative. Seems to me like probably as important as devising which metaphors and narratives get to stick. So what else do I want to say before moving on? Give a quick agenda for the call. Also to tell you that this is probably the least important thing, but this narratives group has been given a new name, which is Narwhal, given that somebody from our group was visited by a mystical narwhal creature who asked this person to pass on the message that we should be named after this creature. And so we've worked retroactively to fit an acronym to that name, which is Narratives Working Group Hopeful and Long-Term, which I think you'll agree is a totally natural name for a group. Thanks, Alina. Cool. So the agenda for this call roughly is that we've had a bit of we've had a little bit of a check-in, little introduction. I'm going to call upon a couple people at some point to bring in some perspectives that they've prepared beforehand. I think, John, you were someone who wanted to bring in some stuff around metaphors you've been working on, Thomas as well. But there will be lots of chances for everybody to feed in. And I have been building up a bit of a map around different metaphors and images that I've been seeing being used in the media that I would love to show you as a kind of primer. And then from there, we will go through some different prompts around what are the kind of images and metaphors that you've been seeing in the media and in the information ecology. What is missing? What have you not been seeing in this landscape? And what are the metaphors and images that you would like to see or that you're working with? And so we'll do this through typing in the chat, having some bits of discussion, and going into breakouts to do some of that deeper sense making, and then come back and feedback all together. Are there any questions before we move on to that? Nope, no questions. Great. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and show you some of this map, which I'm also thinking could become an open editable thing if people from the group would like to feed in and to kind of build this as a resource for us, as a kind of place where we can build up all of these different things that are coming in. I was finding it overwhelming personally, like receiving emails like every day, like 10 emails with like different articles and images, and like, hey, have you seen this? And I was just like, I need to put this out somewhere I can see it, because I'm a visual person. So it's quite an overwhelming map. I want to just give a shout out to Alina, who started another map actually. That, Alina, maybe you want to put the link in the chat, because that could be a great shared resource as well. And then I got inspired by Miro, and I think your map kind of helped me get over the like initial resistance of the scariness of this tool. So this is, I've just been basically dropping different links in here with a bit of text and like little snippets. It's kind of like a scrapbook of different metaphors that I've been seeing. And I'm just going to talk you through the main areas, and then we can open up for more discussion and stuff. So one of the major areas I've seen a lot of images and metaphors being used is this kind of war metaphor. And maybe like as I'm talking, if you want to put in it, if you've seen similar, or if you've kind of got any added context or comments to add, just put them in the chat. So yeah, a lot of like politicians are using, literally saying we're in a war. I think it was Macron used the word war like 4 times in his speech. Boris Johnson talks about this being a wartime government, and somebody in the US also referred to this as our Pearl Harbor, which, there's been some really good commentary on how a pandemic is not a war, and actually how that could be very misleading and a poor metaphor for this, given that a war is something like the kinds of behaviors that can help you survive in a war are not necessarily the same ones that could help you survive in a pandemic. So being careful, actually having a lot of information in a pandemic versus in a war, often you don't have any information, and doesn't matter how careful you are, things can still end up very, very badly. So it's actually, there's some interesting kind of nuance there around whether a war is a good metaphor for this time. I'm just trying to pick out a couple of details. There was a great story put out by Zach Stein around a war broke out in heaven. So it was a kind of different angle on the idea of a war, that, this is a larger kind of mythic war that we're in, and that, that we need to come out of that as the winning side, which, is something we can also talk about. I found some interesting commentary on this time being kind of referred to with words like lockdown and curfew, which brings also this image of kind of being like naughty children being locked down and having done something wrong. So that's also there on the map. And then, yeah, COVID-19 as a demon, comparing the pandemic to the 1918 Spanish flu as well, and World War II, and then also comparisons with 9/11. So there's this kind of historical perspectives. So zooming out from there, it's not perfectly categorized. There's some non-war stuff in this area as well. So like humans are the virus. That's been like another recurring image of actually humans are the virus, and we need to do something about that. We've got kind of transport metaphors. I wrote a thing about a train that we've kind of got off. There's some people talking about a boat, that we're all facing the same storm, but we're all in very different boats. And that that it's this kind of idea of like going somewhere, or like getting off the thing that is moving. Here we've got some animal metaphors, which friends Dugald Hine and Ed Gillespie, they've got a podcast called The Great Humbling. They've got a whole episode that goes deeply into these images of, you know, the black swan, the white swan, the green swan, which kind of situates, it's like a metaphor that then just situates this virus as like a thing and like a situation, and that it's got like certain characteristics. But that, I also kind of wonder what that does to how we think about this. There's also some developmental metaphors, so like the fact that we're in a crucible. I think, John, you used the word crucible in your article. There's a couple of people calling this the chrysalis, of like this, you know, we're in a kind of developmental stage and everything is melting and we're going to come out kind of transformed as a butterfly. So it's like potentially quite a positive image, unless we stay in kind of goo forever and we never actually emerge as a butterfly. And yeah, here's an area of this kind of larger kind of, we're all one humanity, one global humanity. We've got a couple articles here about like love, and this being like a love story. I think that was from Kirsty, who's also part of the group. And then Alice's articles around this as being an unfolding story, which is also helpful to think of this as having kind of beginning, middle, and end, and a progression, and helps us think a little bit more long term about where we're going. And then this is a really big area of a lot of messaging around this crisis being an opportunity. So we've got Arundhati Roy's talking about this being a portal, like this being the moment and like something we can go through as an initiation. Also heard the word initiation, like a kind of global initiation for humanity, of like coming of age. That's also been used quite a lot. We've got a lot around this kind of new possibility now, what is possible that wasn't possible before, the impossible, the unimaginable. Over here we've got, yeah, this kind of the unimaginable has happened. This kind of break from what is normal to a completely liminal zone where, you know, where we don't actually know what's going to happen. And I guess that's kind of implicit in the portal as well, like something's on the other side, but we can't actually grasp what's on that other side. Yeah, a lot around don't go back to normal, and then people commenting on how using the word don't is not very helpful for kind of human psychology of not being something that sticks. When people hear don't do this, they actually just do. Want to do that. Then the folks at Beyond Return, don't go back to sleep, what's being revealed. Some people talking about this being like a dress rehearsal, like a second chance, comparing that with climate change, of like we've been given an opportunity here actually to act where we weren't acting for the kind of larger, more looming crisis. And then a lot of images around this great pause, and the concept that we're in a moment of not doing, and that gives us time and kind of energy to do stuff that we might not have before. And then this morning I saw a tweet from Caroline Lucas around like green steps to better, is like, seems to be another image of kind of moving forward into the future and rebuilding. So rebuilding, changing everything, the hashtag build back better, reset everything. So that's a bit of a digest of not comprehensive, but just some big areas that I've been seeing. I'm going to stop sharing. You can see there's quite a lot of stuff in the chat. If anybody kind of has any burning thoughts or comments, as you kind of heard me talking through that, maybe you've got like some meta sense making around those different images and metaphors that have been used. It'd be great to have a little discussion about that. And then I've got some prompts that we can go through and put in the chat. John, go ahead.
I actually wanted to queue up Ivor and the stuff that he and Casper Takal and Alex Evans have put out in the last week or so on This Too Shall Pass, and the sort of three, I'm going to get them wrong if I try and do it, but the three big myths that you were playing with. So I wonder how they kind of map as a sort of meta thing here as well. Sorry, Ivor.
Geez, thanks, John. Restoration, emergence, and revelation. I was just thinking the same. I mean, in terms of it's just been in our head quite a lot, but the idea of emergence seems the most optimistic. So the context is Alex Evans using Judeo-Christian mythological framings that could be helpful in a British context, given our Judeo-Christian heritage. But the sort of biblical ideas of emergence and revelation, not being negative necessarily, but just being big, and that could be quite helpful.
Ivor, just on the back of that, have you thought about any kind of potential like dangers of using those sorts of myths from religion, or that just comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the clearly one is that not everyone's religious and not everyone has a Judeo-Christian background. So some of it seems boringly obvious and sort of tedious, and sort of so much part of your background it's not even useful, maybe. Or you have entirely different, heritage, and so it seems inappropriate. I think there's something to be said about if you are able to utilize your own heritage, wherever that is, and finding the commonality between them all, then that starts to be useful. But the idea that I think we made stressed in the paper as well, like that's just our heritage. It's not the right one. But it's one that we could draw upon with some confidence. So I would love to hear, different, if there's any similarities to Hindu, Sikh, other indigenous cultures, non-Western religious beliefs in that regard. It's not my wheelhouse per se, so I'm curious.
If I could chip it, and one of the things that brought that to mind was the way some of the language you'd used to map Phoebe kind of fits quite powerfully to some of those. So the idea of like crisis as opportunity definitely matches with the sort of revelation thing but I think revelation was that you talked about it as apocalypse, I think in the report as well, and the sort of the idea of this as a total kind of end. The emergence maps very powerfully to the kind of coming of age thing, and I think there are some universality to it, and restoration, the idea of kind of going back or maybe going back deeper. Those are the sort of some things play through for me, but also the really powerful. And the whole framing of that piece was that you guys wrote was around grief, right? And like what we do need to kind of accept is some pain of leaving stuff behind, which I think is maybe talked about too little, and something that made me think about a lot. It's like, yes, we don't want to go back, but there might be some things that are painful to leave behind, and pretending that there aren't might well kind of repress that and make it actually more difficult to leave stuff behind if we don't take the time to sort of recognize the value of what was there.
Mm-hmm. Just want to call on Ella because I saw you had your hand up as well. Thank you, John.
Yeah, kind of leading on from that, in terms of some of the kind of meta organizing structures, one is time. So just thinking, we've been talking about the past and the future, and when we look at how different kind of how our politics affect how we feel about the past and the future. So often it's progressives who evoke the future, and that alienates the others for whom the future is genuinely a scary place, and the past is a safer place, even if the past past is less good than the present. And so I think it's really interesting. So that's why I'm really interested in the build back better. I think that's really interesting framing. Like you're evoking the past while talking about the future. And so it feels like, yeah, there's just something there about us being very conscious about the way we talk about time and how that will affect different constituencies that we're communicating with.
Thanks, Ella. That's really interesting. Dora, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to, I wasn't personally involved in it, but I can share the results after this, but we did at PERC some polling with Green New Deal and Neon, looking at the recovery messaging, so the kind of idea of build back better and going back versus the sort of future looking messaging around like New Deal and Green New Deal. And it looked like to not a huge degree, but the New Deal future focused messaging was actually kind of more effective for building support for progressive policies. Unfortunately, it seems Build Back Better had kind of gathered a momentum by that point, so it kind of went, to some extent, it's like whether or not that's going to have an impact, that specific piece of research. But I think what you were saying, Ella, about the constituents is super interesting as well, because I have seen research that particularly the kind of recovery messaging, this kind of idea of going back is very effective with older people and sort of specific demographics. But I think this is like a critical question for people wanting to build support for progressive policies, really, is like, how do you essentially make the case for coming through into something that is more equitable, fairer, better than it was, but also really kind of honing into the levels of anxiety about what's happening right now. And I think that that's kind of, a mistake that we've often made on the left personally, and in the last election, we're talking about change all the time, but without necessarily kind of really being sensitive to the degree of anxiety that brings for people as well. So yeah, I'm super interested in getting more into that.
So I just wanted to add to that. I know Will from Unbound really rates the work of Karen Stenner, who, Alice, you might want to jump in here. Is that she does a lot of work around like the effect of different messages, or like how different messages can be perceived by people who are more on the authoritarian side. So like all this messaging around like, let's change everything and let's tear it down and start again can actually be very frightening, and trigger a kind of fear response from people who we might actually want to be targeting. If you want to say something, Alice, and then we could pass to Kieran.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important point. Jonathan Haidt refers a lot to Stenner's work, and she makes this point that actually the more that we become polarized, the more that actually activates the authoritarians, and that it kind of makes that feeling of anxiety more heightened. In fact, I was on a call the other day and it was really interesting. Someone was talking about how pluralism is kryptonite to people who are on the sort of far right, because it's really contrary to what they want, which is this kind of divisiveness. And so this idea of like how we can kind of, I quite like that so thinking about it as a metaphor around a larger us and pluralism being like kryptonite. And so that's really powerful. That's the tool that we have at our disposal, but it's how we can try to kind of coalesce more and agree on what that looks and feels like.
Go for it, Kieran.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I just wanted to add something to Ella's point about time, because I agree that it's absolutely one of the most important vectors in framing. And the thing I'd like to add is that sometimes I think we can too easily associate visions of the future with progressive. We have that in our head that's the way progressives talk. But the language of the future is also, in some very real sense, the language of capital, because the language of capital is a language of speculation. It's a language of investment. I mean, people are actually even futures traders. So capital, in some very real sense, often also evokes the language of the future. And I think that's kind of important in the mix when we're trying to figure out constituencies. And I suppose what that brings me to is that dichotomy between past looking and future looking. I think one of the things we miss all the time is the role of the present. And COVID, particularly for all of its complexities, is a mass moment of sort of simultaneous experience, differentiated obviously, but simultaneous. And I think that's kind of non-trivial. I think it's really non-trivial. And so while we think about battling narratives around, you know, build back or progressive futures, I think it would be a shame if we lost that opportunity to capture some of the story around the present as well, and existing in the present simultaneously and collectively. That's it. That's my point.
That's brilliant, and it kind of connects also to some conversations I've been in with the National Lottery Community Fund of like, how do we actually tell the stories of communities on the ground? Like, you know, there's a lot of talk about narrative, like an abstract thing that we can like decide on and then disseminate, but actually what does it look like to flip that and actually tell the story of what's happening, and from that be able to emerge what needs to happen next. Lisa.
Hey all. I had some reflections about grief and building back, but initially also about simultaneous experience. So, for example, the ABC has been running ads here around "We are one" and but we are many, which is around that simultaneous but differentiated experience. And for some, that's landing really well, but for other communities like Australians, like Indigenous communities or folks who are just doing really tough, that's where that's completely backfiring. As well as, I think the context here in Australia is also one of, yes, there's COVID, but that's like the second existential crisis this year. Like we started with bushfires and there were floods and now there's COVID. So it's just sort of this thing of, like that point, I don't know who made it, but somebody made a point about grief. That may be quite important here also in order for people to be able to somehow be able to connect with each other in future, because people have just had such different experiences through this, and there's some commonality about grief, but it's also quite different. And then the bit around like building back or building back better, that like the context around that looks different, but like I was on a call today with community groups who first had fires, then floods, and now COVID. Any sort of recovery services that were in the community to help folks rebuild after the fires were shut down because of COVID. And essentially, like the only fuel that community has had has been through like their own connections, relationship, and care. And in a way, in frames, like we really briefly at the end touched on it in our breakout group, care and relationships is going to be crucial, but at the same time, like some folks, that's also literally all they've had. So there's been no further support or infrastructure from government to actually, I guess, build that in a way where people don't burn out all the time. So just there will also then be sort of, we'll have to be careful around using those narratives as well, because it just sort of focuses on people who have to just do it by themselves. But yeah, just the context around bushfires, floods, COVID.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I'll just pass to Dave and then Alina, and then I think we'll move on to do a bit of written reflection and deeper chat in some breakouts after that, and then we're finishing at 11:30. Realised I didn't say that, but please, David, over to you, and then to Alina.
Thanks. Alina, were you going to respond directly to that? Yeah, go for it first then.
Just to add on a little bit there to the sort of the we are one and we are many dichotomy going on. One thing that we've seen in New Zealand, and I mean, all things considered, New Zealand's response has been pretty phenomenal. We've really, pretty much got to the point where we've almost eliminated the virus, and so it's been fantastic. But one of the sort of the metaphors we keep hearing was a Maori proverb, he eke waka eke noa, which means we are all in the same canoe, we're all in the same boat. And I think it was very good at the beginning for galvanizing support around the idea of a lockdown. But over the last few weeks, I think myself and a few, others I've been seeing on the internet, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that we're using this Maori proverb, and at the same time, we're not at all in the same boat. And that it is often disadvantaged communities. While some of us are in cruise liners, disadvantaged communities are, 5 adults in a house with 6 children in a leaky boat. And so just that discomfort with the use of a specific proverb in a situation where the people who are of that language are often the ones who are being most marginalized by it. It's been interesting. Over to you, Dave.
You just reminded me of another proverb, Alina, which maybe helps sort of a little bit of what I wanted to say, which is something like, "He who built the house is built by the house." I guess on a sort of meta level, when it comes to storytelling and narratives, there's this question of what you're telling a story for, and we kind of tend to instrumentalize the story. And what Kieran was eliciting for me there was a sense of actually, you might tell a story to actually be present together in a moment, which is sort of the intrinsic value of storytelling. And maybe this sort of seems a bit trite, but go back to your story, Phoebe, about the train and getting off the train. It's like there's a real underlying drive to get back on the train with a better story that can somehow redirect it. But we're already on a train that sort of follows one set of tracks. So if you want to get back on that train, maybe, doesn't matter how good the story is that you tell, it kind of leads one way. And so is there something about the power of choosing not to, or trying not to drive something forward? And funny enough, I was just listening to a piece about the poet John Clare this morning on Radio 4, and John Clare, sort of one of the things that he's most celebrated for is just making lists of what he observes in nature around him, and sort of not as maybe memorable because they're not these huge narratives that drove things forward, but actually he just noticed and was present. And it feels really edgy to suggest that, because there's all this fear that makes me want to, use a story to somehow save the day. But sitting around a fire, telling a story has a deeper aspect to it too.
Thank you. I'm seeing, I guess, Bronwyn, would you want to respond directly to that? Don't want to cut you off. Bronwyn, you're on mute.
I'm not sure if it's a direct response or not. I'm sort of tangling different threads. Do you want to go to someone else if it's not a direct response?
I think go for it, and then after that we'll move on from discussion.
Okay, it was part of it was just a comment about it's coming out of the comments about time, and also the idea that the future can be scary, and I'm just noticing that quite a lot of the metaphors, especially the ones that just focus on time, sort of hold back from being more actively signaling the content of what might come. And so, what is better, for example, if it's built back better. And I just was thinking that there weren't any, there seems to be one of the things that I wrote down for metaphors that I have seen, but also maybe these are the ones that I'm looking for as well, is about regeneration. And maybe this connects, I think John wrote in the chat something about Phoenix, and whether or not he was questioning whether that was cheesy, but just the general idea of regenerative and nurturing something regenerative is both, there's something about that has a content to the relationships that we'll build. I guess it connects to the relationship and care, but I think you can actually work it through some really substantive policies as well, that are signaling kind of the content of what you want as well. And that for me also connects to another set of metaphors that actually does relate partly to what has been said in the last two suggestions about, well, slowing down or pausing. So some people, there was a story called The Great Pause at one point that I found, but just stopping. There's a beautiful video that's been produced by, initially in Spanish, I think it was, called Listen, which is really just sort of urging people to stop altogether. I realize that's not a call to action, but there's something about that that I think is important as well.
Thank you. I feel like there's a lot of really rich stuff here on people who have thought this through. I think just so that we can avoid kind of having to go around every single person, we could just do a little 2-minute brain dump to the question of what are the metaphors in these narratives and images that you're seeing that you think could be powerful. If there's anything that hasn't yet been spoken, maybe we just take 2 minutes now to write in the chat and send that out. And I'll be kind of compiling that into notes as well. But just to say, I think it's a really good idea. Ella just suggested mapping metaphors against values they evoke. And I would suggest, like, if there are these ideas for doing bits of mapping, maybe people might feel like they want to take something away and work on something with others from the group and then come back and present on the next call. So yeah, if there's anyone who would want to help Ella with that, if you're, I mean, not wanting to put that on you, Ella, but is anyone interested in doing that, mapping metaphors and values? Got David, Bronwyn and John and Amy and Ella. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to just put this question in the chat to just get any last, anything else that hasn't been named so far. What are the metaphors, images and narratives you've been seeing that could be powerful? We've covered quite a lot here. I'll just give 2 minutes to think about that. If you want to do your typing and then just raise your hand when you're done, or raise your hand if you've got nothing.
Phoebe, sorry, can you repeat what you asked us to do?
Yes, so just take the next 2 minutes to answer the question, what are the metaphors, images and narratives that you've been seeing that you think are really powerful or could speak to the many? And when you're done, just raise your hand. Cool. I can see people putting their hand up and then going back down to, to add a bit more, so it's maybe not the best tool. I have another question, which is, what do you think about kind of one big narrative, or do you have what's your opinion on whether we need many different stories and metaphors and narratives, but whether it needs something overarching, or that there's this tension or kind of a scale between some people I've been talking to who have like, we need to find the best metaphor versus we need to allow a whole plurality of different stories to happen, but then maybe there's less momentum in a certain direction. So we'll just take 2 minutes again if you've got any viewpoints on that. Yeah, and just raise your hand if you're either done or don't have anything to say. Cool. I think a really interesting thing to go on to before we get a little chance to talk more in breakout rooms is this question of which metaphors and narratives we're seeing that potentially we need to watch or to counter. I think, John, you put that into the chat. So if let's do one more 2-minute writing, brainstorming, and then have a little discussion around that. I think that would be really valuable. So the question is, what are the metaphors, images, and narratives that we're seeing that we need to watch or even counter? So we've got kind of images of war, crime, strict parent and addiction, beginning of the rise of the welfare state, putting the blame onto a group of people like the Chinese. There's a lot of stories going around that the virus was genetically modified in Wuhan, Spanish flu. Yeah, parliamentary process and democratic accountability as being burdensome. And kind of crises justifying drastic measures. Yeah. John, I feel like, because you brought this up, do you have something you might want to say about this? It seems like you might have done some thinking around this already.
Me or John Cracknell?
Which John?
Sorry, John Cracknell. Sorry, yeah.
Around anything in specific, or sorry if I'm dumping too much stuff in the chat.
No, it just would be great to hear from you, because you wrote about the addiction metaphor and the need to kind of watch these metaphors. Is there any kind of overarching theme or sense that you're getting around these sorts of narratives, or what could be done?
It's not very clear yet, but I've been trying to look at some of the things which ISD and Centre for Countering Digital Hate and Hope Not Hate and others are tracking in terms of really damaging far right sort of metaphors and frames, and how do they relate to climate skeptics and climate denial and the sort of general right-wing think tank attacks on regulations and protections? So are those the same things which are being used? So a little bit like your map, but I mean, I don't have anything nearly as sophisticated as your map so far. I was chatting to Will from Unbound about it yesterday. How do we try to capture the extent to which there's crossover and similarity between the things which our opponents are using, but no more than feeling my way into it at the moment.
Does anybody else have anything they'd like to kind of pull out of what they're seeing? Any kind of major themes or noticings?
I feel like one question I've got is, or just around, you know, the point that the initial one that Alec put in the chat around addiction and sort of weaning off. And I guess it's just something about how we challenge metaphor, like whether we directly, whether you replace it with a more powerful metaphor, or whether you directly challenge it and sort of calling it out to say that's, you know, it's an inappropriate use of metaphor, or it's not like that. I guess that's something about strategy, really, about how, yeah, kind of interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting to see how the war metaphor has been called out, you know, so viscerally. You know, there was a great Marina Hyde piece, but it's more that who was it? Was it Emily Maitlis on BBC who gave that kind of searing takedown of that metaphor? So it is interesting to see how public figures are trying to tackle metaphor directly. I think probably the answer is going to be, it's, you know, we need to do both. But it's just really interesting to see metaphor become the subject of the, you know, nightly news.
And this language around the infodemic and the kind of pollution of the information ecology, like it's becoming such a conversation topic. And, you know, like even with the David Icke banning on YouTube, it's like narratives of, are suddenly a new sphere of places to influence and try and control, or Does anybody else want to add anything to perhaps also what, you know, whether there are ways that we can, or as a group, what are the ways that we can see could be helpful to help counter these kinds of narratives, or make a difference? John?
So one of the things that's striking me in the conversation is that the sort of, and it goes back to Alice's thing about plurality, is the singular, the sort of, and David just posted this thing about Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson trying to be kind of Churchill reincarnate, the sort of the hero narrative that tries to say the sort of I'll save you thing, versus that invites us, and in the World War II stuff, the kind of, I was posting about like keep calm and carry on, is a meme that's sort of resuscitated a bit, and I think is very dangerous. But if you can counter that with the multiplicity, that feels like a really interesting tension to mine. And I was just, one of the things I came across the other day was masks not gags turned up as a thing in relation to the NHS originally, as a bit of language that was like, we need personal protective equipment, but don't tell us to shut up, when there was an attempt to sort of silence them. But I wonder, as we come out of lockdown, that starts to feel to me like a really powerful metaphor, like we're all going to be wearing masks, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't. Everyone should be heard. The people who haven't been should be, the kind of the decentralized power should be decentralized, like all that sort of stuff. So the singularity against the multiplicity, the plurality feels really fertile to me.
Kieran?
Am I on mute? No. Building on that point, I think it actually relates to the masks point, which I think is really interesting. It seems that one of the central metaphorical struggles, that if you were to ask me which one do we have to watch, which one do we have to kind of, you know, pour resources into, it comes back to something quite basic, which is the conception of freedom. That's, you know, that's under discussion, and there's a dichotomy there, isn't there, where freedom is either your, you know, individual right to do whatever you want, or freedom as an emergent quality of collective security. And if we believe that freedom is at root an emergent quality that comes from collective security and collective care, finding the right metaphor that links collective care, collective security to that concept of freedom, I think is absolutely vital, because I think that battle is going to kind of, that's almost like the meta battle under which a lot of the narratives are sitting, I think.
That's interesting, and it kind of builds on another topic or theme that's around, like, how do we connect? How are we strategic about connecting different themes, metaphors in ways that could potentially speak to more people? So what are the parts of, like, say, the progressive narrative that could easily meet or kind of join with elements of more of narratives that actually speak more to authoritarian people in a way that maybe is under an umbrella, say, of like the larger us, or like multiplicity, or whatever that somebody spoke about, kind of a fractal organizing of like narratives of what is that overarching organizing pattern of the sorts of narratives we want to see. Amy.
I just want to pick up on the hero narrative, and I think there's been quite a lot of conversation in the chat, not only when it comes to leaders, but actually normal people, and particularly the conversation around key workers. Because here at ODI, we've been doing a lot of work on migrant key workers and kind of tracking the initiatives and reforms and changes we're seeing relating to facilitating them as workers in this response. But I think the hero narrative is a really, really dangerous one, because it exceptionalizes people, and particularly actually when we're thinking about the full spectrum of workers, so not only healthcare workers, but supermarket cashiers and others. I think, yeah, it's been really troubling to us to see the emergence of this hero narrative. And then also Alice mentioned, and I think Stephanie and others, relating to kind of migration more broadly. I think a lot of the kind of problematic dichotomies and narratives we're seeing, and we've seen around kind of us and them, deserving refugees, bad migrants, and so on, are really re-emerging during COVID-19. And I think actually the kind of hero narrative can also play into that, and particularly with the idea of kind of deserving refugees. So that's something we're really wanting to watch. But then also actually, I mean, we've done a data viz which collects together all these examples of migrant key workers, but thinking about how human mobility can be wrapped into this kind of recovery narrative is something I'd be hugely interested in kind of discussing with others. Because obviously at the moment we're seeing a kind of border lockdown, and in many ways it's a really challenging moment for kind of those working in migration, but I think in another ways it's a real moment of opportunity. So yeah, interested also in others' thoughts on how migration and human mobility can be wrapped into kind of constructed narratives about how we all move ahead collectively.
That's really, really interesting. I'm going to suggest that we actually put some kind of ideas in the chat about what we want to talk about on our next call, because I think we could do a call where we have some breakout rooms, almost like an open space. So like Amy, what you're talking about being like one topic that you could get some people to think through. Ella, you've got something around values and matching values and metaphors of narratives. Also these kind of larger themes like mapping, you know, we've talked about time, we've talked about this hero narrative, we've also talked about care and like kind of connecting different narratives. So I'm wondering if that could be quite a helpful thing that we could focus on our next call, is breaking out and kind of going a bit deeper. Other than that, I would suggest, we've got 20 more minutes, and I definitely find it helpful to speak these things through in kind of smaller groups. So what I think we could do is go into breakout rooms, maybe just picking up on like what are these large themes that this group might want to focus on to give us a bit more structure moving forward, and then come back, share those, and make a plan for the next call. So I've just created just 3 breakouts with like 6 people in each. So I'm just suggesting that the topic of the breakouts is what are the kind of areas and themes that you'd like to focus on moving forward, and then we'll come back and share those, and then make a plan for next time. Cool. See you in 10. So I'll say we'll break for 12 minutes and come back, and then do kind of 8 minutes of closing, and then finish at 11:30. So I'll see you soon.
The chat, people.
Oh, here she is.
Hi. I thought I'd just join in on one.
Fly blue flags across the entire group. You know.
I mean, just to kick it off with I think there's a few different levels at which it could work, or which we could work, and I think it's a little tricky at the moment from my mind to sort of understand like what we do. Like so for example, it could be that it's like, can we generate some possible campaigns, like it could be that, and or some possible frames that we want to try and build, and kind of and see if there's willingness to ally around them. So take masks not gags as a thing, and go like, okay, what would a protest look like that was around that? What would you do with physical masks? What would you like? You could imagine an action focused thing like that, or it could be more kind of more meta, and sort of going like, so yeah, let's sort of divvy up around those maybe the areas that you've kind of mapped, or and go like, what are the alarms and the positives that we need around in each of those maps, and put some values to it. I think that note just came to our little group, by the way, Phoebes. You have to send it to everyone if you.
Maybe another one is around like different actors, or different like groups of like how you frame government, or how you develop narratives around government. Public service is one. You can go many different ways, and that has quite a significant impact, I think. And I guess I'd also type that links in with Amy's comment around migrants, refugees. I don't know. Just in addition to what John said.
Nice. Where are you calling from, by the way? I just wanted to ask you, Lisa.
Sorry?
Where are you calling from? Just for
Sydney.
Sydney, cool.
I think Lisa and I have been on Zoom calls before within Sydney Commons Lab.
Oh, yes. Oh, hello. I was wondering. Okay, clicked. Thanks.
Yeah. So John's comment is, I mean, I think it's helpful, though it kind of hones in on a much more kind of targeted purpose for the break, which might be necessary. I mean, I was thinking slightly more. I put up my hand to do the thing about the mapping, the connection between different metaphors and values, which I would find interesting just in principle. But I think there could be an interesting link between that and something that's a bit more concrete, but not quite as focused as what John said, which is once you've got the mapping between the values and the metaphors, to work through a few examples to see how you could counter the metaphor or turn it back on itself. So that conversation we started having about heroes. I mean, I think there was something that people were doing with that was sort of drawing off, thinking about what values were implied by the metaphor, and then basically redeploying the metaphor for different values, and whether we could get a bit more systematic with that, which would basically be helpful for a tool for specific campaigns like John's there.
Thomas?
Hey, yeah, I think what would be useful is try and find metaphors that speak to how we want the world to be rather than how it is now. So I think with the the sort of all in the same boat discussion, obviously we have that instinct to say, well, we're not all in the same boat, but that risks reinforcing it, us versus them. So like if we tell our persuadable audiences that actually you're not in the same boat as these vulnerable groups, from their perspective, then, you know, they don't care about people in a different boat, and it just reinforces that difference. Whereas I think, like, I don't use that, I'm not a fan of that metaphor, but it's more like what we want the situation to be is this shows that we actually are all in the same boat, even if some parts of the boat are shittier than others. If there's a leak in that part of the boat, then the whole boat sinks. And again, that's not a helpful metaphor, I think. But the point being, we want our audience to see themselves as connected to those other people. And so I think it's about how do we find metaphors that we can actually test collectively and find that basically that reinforce a way of thinking about society. And so I think that that's where we, you know, if we are to push any of those other ways of thinking, it'll only work if all the organizations we work with use it. But we need a process to actually work together to try out those different ones. But I mean, the starting point needs to be trying to see what's universal, what we all believe in, both in terms of the ideal outcome, the ideal way society should be, and how we can actually make that change happen. But then, you know, like, I think we temporarily need to set aside our desire to point out the flaws, but more show how things should be.
Are you sort of saying that maybe a piece of work might be like, what's the brief for the metaphor, as it were? Like, what does it have to, what are the criteria? That's what I'm hearing.
A little bit. So like in human rights, for example, most human rights organizations we don't know what the sort of the meta narrative is, right? Or what the narrative we want to promote is. So we've been doing some work trying to test literally just a new story about how human rights works. So it's not about rights or something that are taken away from people or given to people, but it's more on the human, basically the idea of shared humanity. And so we're working, for example, on a metaphor of human family, that we're all part of the same human family. And basically it goes back to the idea of care, that actually, you know, we should be focusing on caring for each other. And the point being, we don't want people to look at situations as there's a victim you should, you know, feel guilty about and give some aid to. It's more that human rights is about just the general act of taking care of each other.
John Cracknell, have you already spoken? Maybe I missed your reply.
No, I haven't, because I don't quite know how to. I'm just still listening, and it's fascinating, and my head's about to explode, which would be annoying, to be honest.
That would not be.
But it's been so rich, the chat as well as the conversation and the thing. I'm like, whoa, with the maps at the beginning, I'm like, I'm not going to be able to spend the time that I want to spend trying to assemble all of the stuff that's just been in the chat. But that's what I want to do. I want to sort of decompress somehow and try to put some of these brilliant ideas that have been flying around in some relationship with each other, maybe based on your existing map. Beyond that, I don't quite know how to.
That would be great. I mean,
steps forwards.
That would be really good. I mean, I'd when you mentioned that kind of mapping the like negative, you know, kind of positive, negative, it would be great if you wanted to sync up for like an hour or two or something on the maps and, you know, do some work on that.
Yeah, I'd love to. We have a very simple, I can share it afterwards. We have a very simple map based on a perk map of values that is based on Shalom Schwartz's work originally, kind of thing, whatever, where we tried to put pro and anti-regulation narratives and sort of frames onto it. This is a little while back before we started working on Unchecked properly, but you know, so how do they kind of attach to different value sets, kind of thing, or whatever? Cotton wool kids versus nanny state versus whatever. So I can share that, but it's really basic. But moving further in that kind of direction, I think would be really
great. Thank you.
What do you want? Where would you like this to get to, Phoebe? Like, what sort of thing? Like, I know it's not your group and you're holding it with us, but like, I feel like we're sort of teasing with this question a bit.
Do you mean the whole group, SG3, or this little group right now?
Both, I guess. Like, yeah. What do you have a sense of the shape of the answer to your question? Because I'm like, it's yeah.
Yeah, I think this was just an opportunity. I saw this as an opportunity to start surfacing some of these areas of interest, because obviously the more we can actually start to, there's just so much meaningful and rich stuff happening in this group. But if we just stay as one big group, like without different focuses, it'll just keep being like a stew. So what I'm seeing is like different areas, different people maybe taking on, you know, writing an article on this area, coming back to the group with some, you know, like, I think I'm just seeing the need to create a bit more complexity as opposed to just like stew. So let's start to like find the little groups within the group.
Nice.
That makes sense.
I also, am I right? And I sort of heard what you said at the beginning as saying that there was a larger group beyond this entire group that was actually looking at quite focused things about strategic communication. And so this group tonight as a whole is to some extent meant to stir up the stew, not completely chaotically, but meant to not be quite so fast to the strategic campaigns.
Exactly. So this group is a bit more like the deeper thinking and sensing. And if we have kind of outputs or, you know, like the sorts of things, even just like the chat kind of written up and sorted through a bit, like can be a very good, great output to hand over to the other groups that are doing more like strategic targeting, amplification. Maybe Thomas, I'll just bring you in when we go back into the main room to just say like for a minute of like what SG2 and SG1 are focusing on and how these two groups could be kind of connected. I think that's there's just so much in my head, to be honest, that I'm trying to like bring in at different points in this call that I'm hoping that the important parts get through.
It makes me wonder a little bit is whether you could, it might work to be even more like direct about that question. So like, what ideas do people have for articles that they might want to work in? Like can we actually? I know like it might feel a bit forced. That might not be right, but I think the sense of like, does anyone have a sort of title they'd like to write to but can't do on their own? And does anyone want to help them with that? Like a bit more of a sort of marketplace of stuff that's a bit more explicit.
Yeah, it sounds like a great idea.
I think it might also be just useful to sort of maybe ask the group, does anyone, you know, have an idea of a good methodology for actually identifying the metaphors we want, or particularly the worldview? Because I think a lot of the time it's driven by what the audience research already says, you know, like what's already out there. And the point is, if we want to change things, like one of my beliefs is that we should be starting with where we want things to go and then find the best language that works with that, rather than like starting with the language that's already out there.
Yeah.
So Neon did a New Economy Organizing Network did it 58 seconds. They did a report in 2018 where they, you know, tested, they kind of laid out the vision, then they tested the metaphors and they worked backwards. And one of them actually.
She must have she must have left. Because he was back in the main room.
So it's the best example that I know. It's the Reframing the Economy report.
Okay.
I mentioned that to you before, Phoebe.
Okay, I'll definitely have a look at that.
And I feel like
I was typing something in the chat and then I pressed the return button on the chat, but obviously my cursor was somewhere else and it must have made it. So I succeeded.
I took myself out.
It's all right. We're all
working it out.
Yeah.
All has been so rich. It's like, oh my god, so much information.
I need to go and lie down in a darkened room.
Yeah.
I feel like these guys here just like conked out.
John Cracknell said his head was actually about to explode, so I feel like we have a medical emergency.
Nice.
Great. So we have not very long before we need to end the call. The sorts of ideas, I'd like to just give a chance for one person from each group to give like a short, maybe like 2 or 3 points that came out from your breakout. The sorts of ideas that were going on in our group were around how we can actually work out how to kind of collaborate moving forward. And specifically the question, does anybody have I think, does anyone have any articles that they feel really called to write, but maybe can't write on their own? Are there any specific kind of actions or like projects or, you know, like just inquiries that might come out of this that people might want some support on until our next call in 2 weeks? And the other question that came out was, does anybody have a good idea for a methodology for deciding on a metaphor or worldview that we'd like to kind of run with in this group? And we've had the suggestion of the Neon 2013, is it Changing the Frame? Or what was it called, Thomas?
I just put it in the chat, reframing the economy.
Reframing the economy.
I think that's what Bronwyn was talking about. But
Yeah,
Thomas,
that's right,
you sent
2018.
that to me privately, so you have to send it to everybody else.
Oh yeah, it might have been privately shared. That does happen. Yep. So those are the two. If anybody has an article or something that they feel like they'd really like to write or to start like an inquiry on, then please do, put it in the chat or unmute and invite people to support you. Could we hear maybe from one person from each of the other two groups before we close?
I could do our group maybe. There was definitely a point around using some of this time to dig deeper into particular metaphors. You know, how usable are they? What kind of contradictions might they hold? How might they be used in practice? There was an interest in following the journey from metaphor to policy. How do metaphors find their way into policy? And on that point again, looking at the direction in which that happens, is policy driving common understanding of metaphor, or is common understanding of metaphor ultimately influencing policy, or both, which is probably the answer. But those were some of the things I think we focused on. Maybe I've missed one there. I feel like I've missed one, but.
Great, thank you. And someone from the final group.
Great, I'm happy to have a go. So we talked about, we've all got this kind of burning urgency to look at some of these bigger ways of understanding the narrative that we sorry, I've suddenly lost my power to speak. So, you know, we're getting all this kind of thinking now about meta-narrative, from Alex's work to your work, John, Alexander, and there's lots of thinking happening around these wider narratives, and actually it would be really helpful to start mapping them. And there's some urgency there, because from a funder perspective, funders are at the moment quite quickly trying to understand which of all this like evolving meta narrative field, where should they be kind of investing, and so it would be really helpful to do some collective mapping and sense making around that, and to make sure we include the work of the other side, however we want to characterize that, in this analysis. So yeah, we were like, yes, it's really helpful to think about metaphor, but can we also quite soon start to think about these broader narratives?
Just wanted to add, we also spoke about, so Rosemary's point was also about like the relationships and care, and lifting up also what's authentic, and I think there was also stuff, Tony, you were speaking about nature as well, and bringing that in, but also the authentic and the meta. I was also thinking about, like, is that sometimes also intention?
Thanks. And Ella, just to pick up on your point, could you give an example of a broader narrative versus a metaphor?
Yeah, so when Alex is talking about narratives of restoration, it's more than a metaphor. It's about a particular kind of story. So it's kinds of stories.
Yeah, kind of myths. Great. All right. There's a lot that, from this conversation and just generally in this group, I think it's a really rich group of people with a lot of work that could potentially fit together and like feed off each other in really interesting ways. I think one big question is how we would like to, I'd like to offer that we might want to stay in touch in a way between the calls. And I have a suggestion, or maybe somebody, do you have a suggestion? Did you put your hand up, David? No? Okay. If anybody has suggestions of how we could do that, I will be kind of typing up the chat and maybe we can be making a bit of sense around doing some sense making together, like sorting through some of the stuff that's come out of this conversation. I'll also share the recording, and yes, there are other, so John Cracknell has offered to jump in onto the map that I presented at the beginning to help start making more sense of kind of positive versus negative narratives and metaphors. There's the piece around the mapping of the values with the narratives and metaphors that you brought up, Ella. I'm just thinking how to continue this. A group that I've been working with in a different context has been using a Google, really simple Google Mail list, which is kind of like the most old school piece of social media technology you can get, where it's basically like an email list and you can just email in like long threads. But I'm just going to suggest that for now. And then if we wanted to move to a Slack or like a more, another platform, then we can always do that. But thank you so much for all of your contributions, and looking forward to following up and speaking again in 2 weeks' time. And see you soon.